Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Hedges, and this is One More Thing. One More Thing is something I'm trying out. It's an informal video where I get to share some thoughts or images or illustrations related to a recent sermon that I preached, but ultimately didn't make it into the final version of the sermon. For those of you who know me, you know that my sermon writing involves a lot of cutting and editing. Or I'll try and sneak in more information than there's time for by using the apology/warning phrase, and one more thing. And even when I do that, there's still a lot that gets written, but ultimately goes unheard. And sometimes I feel like there are stories or examples that do need to live somewhere beyond that earlier, unheard, longer draft. So I'm trying them out here, offering the one more thing from sermons. So this Sunday's gospel was Jesus's parable of the weeds from Matthew 13. And I'm including a link to my sermon as well as a link to the manuscript along with this video. This really isn't a supplement for the sermon. It's going to make more sense if you've read or heard the sermon and then get to see these one more things connected to them. The parable is about a farmer who plants wheat, and while everyone is sleeping, an enemy comes and sows weeds into the same field as the wheat. When the wheat starts to grow, so do the weeds, and the farmer and the workers come and see what's happened. And the workers ask the farmer if they should just go in and pull up the weeds to get rid of them. And the farmer says no, that the two need to grow together. And if you dig a little bit more into farming practices, it's because wheat has a really weak root system, especially if it's young. So if you were to pull up the weeds, you'd pull up the wheat too, and there'd be nothing remaining. So Jesus tells the workers to let them both grow. And at the harvest time, the farmer will ask the harvesters to separate the wheat and the weeds, getting rid of the weeds and then bringing the wheat to the barn for harvest. And for the sermon, I focused on how parables are meant to kind of shock us out of how we've come to accept the world or to live our lives. And that the shock of parables are always telling us something about God more than something about us. And that finally we should be bringing our lives to these parables and discerning where the shock of this parable might find a home or have a word for our lives. For the sermon, there were four one more things that I'm going to talk through briefly here. The four are: 1, parables can be metaphors. 2, parables aren't always metaphors. And 3 and 4 are actually part of the same thing, that are parables require discernment, part 1, and parables require discernment, part 2. So for number 1, parables can be metaphors. So sometimes metaphors can do more to reveal our reality than any prose-bound explanation possibly could. And I want to lift up an illustration or an example of that by poet Hanif Abdul-Rakib, who brings to life the truth of the power of metaphors with his poem series, How Can Black People Write About Flowers at a Time Like This? So I want to share my screen to show you the tweet behind this poem series. Abdul-Rakib says, I was at a reading shortly after the election, and the poet who was Black was reading gorgeous poems which had some consistent and exciting flower imagery. A woman who was white behind me, who thought she was whispering to her neighbor, said, how can Black people write about flowers at a time like this? And I thought it was so absurd in a way that didn't make me angry, but made me curious. Also a great way to talk about a parable. What is the Black poet to be writing about at a time like this, if not to dissect the attractiveness of a flower, that which can arrive beautiful and then slowly die right before our eyes? I thought flowers were the exact thing to write about at a time like this. So I began this series of poems, all with the same title, I thought it was much better to grasp a handful of different flowers, put them in a glass box, and see how many angles I could find in our shared eventual demise. So I've included a link to that tweet, and as well as a link for you to be able to buy the collection of poetry that features the How Can Black People Write About Flowers at a Time Like This. And I'm going to read one of those poems at the very end. But for now, I'm going to keep it moving. And I just want to share a graphic that I made so you can follow along with the one more things instead of just watching me. So we talked about how parables can be metaphors. At the same time, parables aren't always metaphors. So the second one more thing is the story of June and Angie Provost, who are generations-long sugarcane farmers in Louisiana. The New York Times 1619 Project has a 2-episode podcast focused on the story of the Provosts and their farm. Now, June Provost was raised by sugarcane farmers. He learned to love to farm from his dad, who was a sugarcane farmer, and was one of the fastest growing, most well-known sugarcane farmers in Louisiana. He took over his dad's farm when his dad was sick, and at that point it meant that he was overseeing sugarcane growing over 5,000 acres of farmland. Now, June went to a bank to receive a crop loan, which all farmers do because you make your money off of the crop, which means at the beginning of the season, you don't have the money. So you take out a loan, you plant, produce, harvest, and then the money from the crop pays back the loan, and so on. June went to a new bank because the bank that his family had used was no longer giving out crop loans, and presented all of this impressive financial information, and then just didn't hear back from the bank. Eventually, he did hear back pretty late in the season and managed to work around the clock in order to still produce a crop. But the 1619 Project picks up on this story and explores the very intentional ways that the Provost farm and their ability to yield a crop was being disrupted by this reliance on a bank and on a loan, and being able to see the way that that particular sowing of discord, just like the sowing of the weeds, is connected to racial injustice in this country. So it's a really powerful story for you to know. It's a great way to get connected to the 1619 Project. And it reminds us that even when we hear parables about a farm from long ago in the Bible times, there are stories that can show us that parables aren't always metaphors, that there are still real-time stories happening today where the effort to yield a crop, to make it to harvest, is being systemically and intentionally undone. So that is one more thing, number 2. Like I said, one more things 3 and 4 are actually 2 pieces of the same. And both of those are around the idea that parables require discernment. So the first is parables require discernment and the reminder that not all issues are wheat. So remember that in the parable, the point is that wheat is really fragile. It has a fragile root system, so you can't go in and start yanking up things around it, or it'll ruin the whole thing. And I ended up talking about that as it relates to internal tensions for white people about anti-racism, the desire to pluck up our discomfort, and how it would actually undo any growth for the seeds of anti-racism that might be planted in us. But I was really hesitant because I was imagining all the other ways that people could take this idea of you have to let things grow together, you have to wait it out, and try and apply it to other issues. And so I wanted to talk briefly about the reminder that not all issues are wheat. Some of them are tomato plants, which I talk about in my sermon as having really sturdy root systems. So they're very grounded and strong, and so weeds can be plucked up around them. And I wanted to discuss this idea and show the importance of discerning around parables as it relates to the call to defund the police. So we might imagine that our plant of policing is actually the tomato plant, that the plant of policing has deep roots in our country, in our history, in our society, and yields the fruits of militarism and violence. So that any efforts to move into the plant space will be quickly pulled away and will have no chance at making lasting change. Or we could say that the tomato plant is actually the Black and brown communities who, despite consistent, intentional, and evil efforts to undo the strength of that plant across generations, has found a way to persist, to yield fruit, and to await the harvest. And that we shouldn't allow the weeds of police brutality or over-policing to continue to try and invade and snuff out this tomato plant. So those are two very different illustrations. It's interesting to think which one would resonate with you. It's not about it all being relative. It's about bringing a spirit of discernment and really moving into the parable and seeing what seems to resonate with what we hear Jesus teaching about in terms of aligning himself with those who are vulnerable. So parables require discernment, part one, not all issues are wheat. And then finally, parables require discernment, part two, what if we are the weeds? And I was thinking about that as it relates to what's going on in Portland, Oregon right now, what I wrote as federal forces invading Oregon and plucking up protesters. So that image of the weeds and pulling up. So just briefly, Matthew's parables include a lot of judgment scenes, and in this parable it's called the harvest time. And it's important to note that the church has a long history of emphasizing judgment as punishment, and a long history of wanting to be able to say who is wheat and who is weeds, who is in and who is out. And we should note that it seems that it's always the people who are saying it are also wheat. And I think it's really important that we don't gloss over Jesus's numerous warnings that we'll be judged, but we'll be judged based on how we treat each other. And with that, we also have to note that Jesus never asks us to be harvesters. Jesus never says we'll be the ones who determine what is wheat, what is weed, what needs to be separated out and burned, and what can be used for harvest to feed and to nourish. All Jesus tells us is that at the harvest time, on the day of judgment, we'll be judged based on how we cared for the least among us, how we cared for the most vulnerable, how we cared for the crucified class of our own time, as Kelly Brown Douglas says. And Jesus says that whatever we do to those who are the most at risk of being treated wrongly, violently, oppressively, we do to the Christ. And so we have to remember that for all the talk of judgment and the desire to say who is doing wrong and who is doing right, that Jesus aligns himself with those who our society has said need to be weeded out, those who our society works very hard to weed out. So you see already there can be this playing around with or complications on what counts as a weed and what counts as wheat. So for that, the illustration, the one more thing, in Portland, Oregon right now, protesters are being plucked off the streets by federal officers, an escalation by President Trump to dominate, his word, dominate protesters who have persistently assembled to speak out about police brutality and racial injustice. And the use of force has been denounced by local elected officials, including the governor of Oregon, who has called this a blatant abuse of power. And so what I want to lift up as the one more thing is for us to consider, to discern who decides which of us are wheat and which of us are weeds. And to recognize that in our current reality, it is most often those with power who get to decide that. Now, in our democracy, different views are permitted to grow, and it's free and fair elections, along with hindsight and history, that decide which plant or which view yields a fruitful and nourishing crop. It goes against our societal ecology for those who are impatient with stubborn weeds to remove them prematurely and to remove them with brute force. In doing so, they put the entire field, the entire society, the entire premise of how we exist in the world at risk. It is not for us to declare which are wheat and which are weeds. And when those trying to do so are also those who have access to and can be armed with systems of power, we must be very, very weary. And it's important to imagine in this parable, as Christians, the farmer, the landowner is always God. And so who is acting as the farmer, the one who should get to decide who's in and who's out in our current society? And how does it go against the way that we've decided we function as a government and as a society? So that is example 2. I invite you to read the New York Times article that talks about the federal forces, the violent tactics that are being used against citizens as they use their right to protest, and especially how these federal forces are going against what local officials say they need or want in terms of support to maintain peace. So those are my 4 one more things to go with my sermon. 1, parables can be metaphors, and they bring out powerful truths in that way. 2, parables aren't always metaphors. They are based on real inequalities and struggles that are still being played out in our history and communities today. 3, parables require discernment. You can't approach all situations following the rule of one parable. And 4, parables require discernment in terms of paying attention to how we are living and functioning as a society, and the possibility that perhaps if we take a parable too far or are not paying attention to the different roles, we might find ourselves as the weeds being plucked up and pulled away by systems of power. So thanks for listening. I'm going to end with one of the poems from the series, How Can Black People Write About Flowers at a Time Like This? With my eyes closed long enough, I can at least remember the popping of gum thrashing between Jasmine's teeth. I would like for memory alone to declare me forgiven, but I would be lying if I said I recall the color of the dress or the way her hair spread its many arms along the blacktop. I nurse whatever visions I must for the sake of enduring. Of course, I tell myself it was the popping of gum. Of course, I say that she was pulled to the ground by revelry and nothing else. Of course, I do not ask you to relive with me the funeral, though by now you surely know there was one.